This really happened to me, though some days I still struggle to believe it. It just goes to show you that the devil can sometimes be found wearing a collar. The moment it all came crashing down was a Thursday night in the parish hall of St. Jude's. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and Murphy oil. Soap. I was standing in front of the parish council, my hand resting on the heavy green leather of the annual ledger, a book I had personally kept for 22 years. A young, sharp-suited man from the archdiocese, someone I'd never seen before, pointed a manicured finger at a column of figures. "The numbers in this ledger, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room, "do not match the finalized statement sent to our office. We're looking at a discrepancy of over $200,000. His eyes, cold and blue, flicked past me to the man sitting at the head of the table. "Father Michael," he said with a tone of rehearsed gravity, "I'm afraid your trust has been profoundly misplaced. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The world seemed to shrink down to that polished oak table, the accusatory finger, and the face of the man I'd considered my closest friend for over 3 decades. Father Michael, with his silver hair and compassionate eyes, the man who had given the eulogy at my husband Frank's funeral, didn't look at me. He stared at the ledger, a mask of deep, sorrowful disappointment settling over his features. It was a look he had perfected over the years, one he used when speaking of fallen angels and human weakness. He slowly shook his head, a gesture of profound regret that was aimed at the entire room, and by extension, the entire world. "Eleanor," he finally whispered, his voice cracking with feigned emotion. "How could you?" That was the kill shot. Not the auditor's sterile accusation, but that soft, heartbroken question from him. It was a masterstroke of theater. In that instant, I wasn't Eleanor Vance, the woman who had balanced these books to the penny since the Clinton administration, the woman who organized every bake sale, charity drive, and funeral luncheon. I was a thief, a pariah, a little old lady who had betrayed her parish, her community, and her God. I saw it in the faces around the table, shock hardening into suspicion, then curdling into pity and disgust. Margaret Daly, who I'd known since first grade, wouldn't meet my eyes. Mr. Chen, the council president, looked down at his hands as if he'd just witnessed something obscene. My own voice felt like a stranger's when it finally emerged, thin and brittle. "What are you talking about? Those aren't my numbers. I never submitted those statements." The auditor slid a glossy printed report across the table. "Your signature is on the cover letter, Mrs. Vance." I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. There it was. My name, Eleanor Vance, signed in a flawless imitation of my elegant, slightly slanted cursive. It was perfect, too perfect. My own signature had grown a bit shaky in the last few years, a subtle tremor that came with age. This one was firm, confident, and utterly damning. It was the signature of a woman without a conscience. That's not right, I stammered, my mind a fog of confusion. "Michael, you know my handwriting. You know my work." I looked at him, pleading. This was all a terrible mistake, a clerical error from downtown that he, my friend, would help me clear up. He finally raised his eyes to meet mine. The compassion was gone. In its place was a chillingly remote sadness, the kind a surgeon might feel before an amputation. "I thought I did, Eleanor," he said softly, and the words landed like stones. "I truly thought I did." He then turned to the council, his voice regaining its familiar authoritative timbre. "In light of this devastating discovery, I'm asking Mrs. Vance to take an immediate and indefinite leave from all her parish duties. The Archdiocese will be conducting a full forensic audit. Until then, I ask for your prayers, for Eleanor, and for our wounded community, wounded. As if I were a disease, I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me as I stood there, frozen, my hand still on the leather-bound lie. No one defended me. No one questioned the slick auditor or the perfectly forged signature. Father Michael's word was gospel, and he had just pronounced me a sinner. He had taken 30 years of my life, of my loyalty and my faith, and turned it into ash in less than 5 minutes. I was escorted out of the hall by 2 ushers from the Knights of Columbus, men I'd served coffee to 1,000 times. They were gentle, but their touch felt like steel. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, I could hear Father Michael's voice, already leading them in a prayer for my fallen soul. I walked out into the cold Boston night, the sting of betrayal so sharp, so absolute, it felt like I had forgotten how to breathe. The 65 years of my life, the reputation I had so carefully built, had just been murdered in the basement of St. Jude's, and the man holding the knife was the one I trusted most on earth. My first thought wasn't about the money or the ledger. It was a cold, clear, and terrifying realization. He had planned this. Every word, every gesture was a performance, and I, his most devoted friend, was the sacrifice. The days that followed were a special kind of hell, a quiet, suffocating torment. My phone, usually buzzing with calls from parishioners about potluck schedules or prayer intentions, fell silent. The women from my rosary group, who I'd met with every Tuesday morning for 15 years, suddenly had conflicting appointments. When I ventured to the local Star Market on Beacon Street, I could feel the whispers trailing me down the aisles like a foul odor. I saw Margaret Daly near the deli counter. She saw me. Her eyes widened in panic, and she practically ran with her cart toward the frozen foods section. The ostracism was swift and brutal. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, widow of Frank, pillar of the community. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer mine. The Archdiocese sent a formal letter. It was cold, legalistic, and terrifying. It spoke of financial malfeasance and potential legal ramifications. It strongly advised me to retain counsel. I sat at my dining room table, the one Frank and I had bought 40 years ago, and read the words over and over. It felt like a dispatch from an alternate reality. I had lived my life by the rules. I paid my taxes, said my prayers, and treated people with kindness. I believed in order, in fairness, in a God who rewarded the faithful. But the God I knew seemed to have left the building. In his place was a silent, empty heaven. Father Michael, of course, never called. His betrayal was absolute. He had not only accused me, he had abandoned me to the wolves he'd summoned. I thought back on the last few months, searching for a clue, a sign that I had missed. My husband Frank had passed away 2 years prior, and Michael had been my rock. He'd visit me at home, bringing communion when I was too grief-stricken to attend Mass. We'd sit in my living room, drinking tea, and he'd listen as I talked about Frank, about my loneliness, about my fears for the future. He'd pat my hand and say, "The Lord provides, Eleanor, and your church family is here for you." He'd encouraged me to throw myself back into my work for the parish. "We need you," he'd said. "Your skills are a gift from God." It was all a lie. He wasn't comforting a grieving widow. He was grooming his scapegoat. He saw my grief not as a wound to be healed, but as a weakness to be exploited. The realization made me physically ill. The anger came slowly, a low tide creeping in to replace the shock and sorrow. It started as a spark in the dead of night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying that parish council meeting in my head. "How could you?" His words echoed in the darkness. How could I? The question was preposterous. The question was, how could he? The man of God, the community leader, the trusted friend. How could he look me in the eye, week after week, knowing he was weaving this web of deceit around me? That spark of anger began to burn. It burned away the tears, the self-pity, the paralyzing fear. I was 65 years old. I had raised 2 children, buried a husband, and survived everything life had thrown at me. I was not going to let my story end like this, whispered about in a grocery store by people who once called me a friend. I would not be erased by a lie. My husband Frank had been a union man, a fighter. He never backed down from a bully. He used to say, "Ellie, the truth has sharp elbows. You just have to be willing to use them." One morning, about 2 weeks after the meeting, I woke up before dawn. The sky was still a bruised purple over the rooftops of my South Boston neighborhood. I made a pot of coffee, the strong kind Frank used to like, and sat down at the dining room table with a blank notebook and a pen. The Archdiocese wanted a forensic audit? Fine, I would give them one. I may not have had access to the church's current records, but I had something better. I had my memory, and I had 22 years' worth of my own meticulous handwritten notes, old checkbook registers, and duplicate deposit slips stored in neat file boxes in my attic. I had kept everything. It was a habit born of Depression-era parents, a squirrel-like instinct to never throw anything away that might one day be useful. I hadn't known it then, but I had been archiving the evidence of my own innocence for over 2 decades. Father Michael thought he was dealing with a frail, grieving old woman. He had forgotten I was also a damn good bookkeeper. He had forgotten that I knew where every single penny was supposed to go, and I would find out where they went instead, if it was the last thing I ever did. I pulled on an old sweater and climbed the creaky stairs to the attic. The air was cold and smelled of cedar and thyme. In the corner, under a dusty canvas sheet, were the banker's boxes, labeled by year in my familiar cursive. I ran my hand over the top of the one marked 1998. It was time to go to work. I wasn't just going to clear my name. I was going to find out why this happened. I was going to follow the money. I had a feeling it would lead me straight back to the man in the collar, and when it did, I would be ready. The hunt had begun, not in the chaos of a police station or a lawyer's office, but here, in the quiet dust of my own home, surrounded by the ghosts of bake sales and bingo nights past. He thought the past was buried, but for me it was an arsenal. I started with the most recent years, working my way backward. I turned my dining room into a command center. The polished wood surface disappeared under stacks of old bank statements, vendor invoices, and my personal ledgers. For the first few days, it was a blur of numbers and caffeine. I cross-referenced every check I had written on behalf of the church with my own records and the bank statements I'd luckily kept copies of. At first, everything lined up. The payments to the utility companies, the stipends for the organist, the orders for communion wafers and wine. It was all exactly as it should be. The pristine, boring finances of a small, well-run parish. I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I wrong? Was I chasing shadows driven by paranoia? Then, I found the first one. It was a check from 3 years ago, made out to Ecclesiastical Restorations Inc. for $15,000. I remembered it clearly. Father Michael had told me the Archdiocese had mandated a new expensive fire-retardant treatment for the antique wooden confessionals. I had written the check, logged it in my ledger, and filed the invoice. But as I looked at the bank statement, something was off. The check had been cashed, yes, but there was another entry right next to it that I didn't recognize. A wire transfer for the exact same amount, $15,000 to the same company, dated just 2 days later. A duplicate payment. My heart started to beat a little faster. A simple mistake, possibly, but I had balanced the books that month. A $15,000 error would have thrown the entire budget out of whack. It would have been a glaring red flag, but my old ledgers showed everything balanced perfectly, which meant the money to cover that second payment had to have come from somewhere else. I started digging through the donation records, and there it was. A large anonymous cash donation of $16,000 had been recorded the week before the duplicate payment. It was just enough to cover the mistake and leave a little extra in the coffers so no one would notice. It was too neat, too convenient. I went online and did a search for Ecclesiastical Restorations Inc. The company had a bare-bones website, full of stock photos of beautiful European cathedrals. It listed a corporate address in Wilmington, Delaware, a notorious haven for anonymous shell corporations. There was no phone number, only a P.O. box. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system, a well-oiled machine for skimming money. Father Michael would approve a legitimate, necessary expense. I would cut the check. Then, he would authorize a second hidden payment for the same invoice, covering his tracks with an opportune, anonymous cash donation that he himself would have skimmed from the collection plates. I was the one signing the first check, the legitimate one. My signature was all over the paper trail of the real expenses. The fraudulent payments were wire transfers, authorized directly by him, the sole signatory on the main parish accounts besides me. He had built a secret parallel system of theft right under my nose, using my meticulous work as the perfect cover. I spent the next week hunting for more. I found another one 6 months later, a $20,000 invoice for repairing the slate roof, and another duplicate payment, this time covered by a bequest from a recently deceased parishioner that I had no memory of. Then a payment to a landscaping company for tree removal that never happened. One after another, the ghosts of his greed began to rise from the pages. It was always the same pattern. A real invoice, a duplicate wire transfer, and a phantom donation to cover the deficit. Over the last 5 years alone, I tallied it up. It was nearly $250,000. The auditor hadn't been wrong about the number. He'd just been wrong about the thief. The deepest cut came when I examined the records for the St. Francis Fund, the homeless outreach program my Frank had started 20 years ago. It was his legacy, funded by a small endowment he had left in his will. The fund was meant to provide meals and blankets for the homeless who took shelter in the church's narthex during the harsh Boston winters. I found multiple payments made from that specific fund to a Catholic Charities logistics group. But Frank had set up the fund to be managed by a specific team of volunteers to buy supplies directly. There was no need for a logistics company. When I searched for this group, I found nothing. It didn't exist. He had been stealing from the poor. He had been stealing my husband's legacy. I sat there in the quiet of my house, the evidence laid out before me, and I felt a rage so pure and cold it was almost serene. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about sacrilege. Not just against the church, but against the memory of a good man, against every person who had ever dropped $1 into the collection basket, believing they were doing God's work. My grief for my lost friendship with Michael curdled into something else, something harder and more dangerous. It was resolve. I knew I couldn't just walk into the archdiocese with a box of old papers and my accusations. They had already chosen their side. They had their slick auditors and their lawyers. They would bury me, discredit me as a vindictive, confused old woman. The institution would protect itself. It always did. Father Michael knew that. It was the bedrock of his power, the source of his untouchable arrogance. He wasn't just a priest. He was a fortress, built of piety and bureaucracy. An attack on him would be seen as an attack on the church itself, and the walls would close in to repel the threat. I was the threat. That evening, I called my son David. He's a public defender in Philadelphia, a world away from the quiet parish life of Boston. He's sharp, cynical, and has little patience for the church, which had always been a point of contention between us. I told him everything. I expected him to say, "I told you so." I expected a lecture. Instead, he was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight with anger. "Mom," he said, "don't talk to anyone. Don't go to the diocese. Don't go to the police, not yet. You have the what. Now we need the who and the how. You've got the skeleton. We need to put flesh on it. What do you mean?" I asked. "Ecclesiastical Restorations incur the landscaping company. The fake charity. They're all just names on a screen right now. We need to find out who is behind them. Who is cashing those checks? Where is the money going? A Delaware P.O. box isn't enough. You need a name. You need a face." He was right. I had a map of the crime, but I needed to prove who the criminal was. And for that, I had to step out of the past and into the present. I had to get closer to Father Michael's current operations. But how? I was an outcast. The doors of St. Jude's were closed to me. I was locked out of the very place I needed to be. The next Sunday, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I went to Mass. Not at St. Jude's, but at Holy Cross Cathedral in the South End. I needed to think, to be in a sacred space that didn't feel tainted by his betrayal. As I sat in the back pew, the scent of incense hanging in the air, I watched the priest on the altar. I watched the way the congregation revered him, the automatic trust they placed in his robes and his title. Father Michael had that same power, and he wielded it like a shield. People saw the collar, not the man. They saw the shepherd, not the wolf. And that's when the idea came to me. It was a terrible, risky idea. It felt like a sin in itself. But Frank always said you couldn't fight a bully by playing by his rules. You had to get into his head. You had to use his own arrogance against him. Father Michael's greatest strength was the blind trust people placed in him. His parishioners, the council, the archdiocese, they all saw what he wanted them to see. But there had to be someone else. Someone who saw him when the mask was off. He wasn't a monk. He was a man living in the world. A man with a secret, lavish life funded by stolen money. A man like that has to have accomplices, or at least people he pays for services, and paid people can be convinced to talk. My gaze fell upon a woman a few pews ahead of me, meticulously polishing the brass collection basket before the offertory. She was one of the church cleaners, anonymous, invisible to most. But people like her, the ones who cleaned the offices and emptied the trash, they saw everything. They were the ghosts in the machine. And I knew just the ghost I needed to talk to. Her name was Maria. She was a young immigrant from El Salvador who had started cleaning the rectory at St. Jude's about a year ago. She was quiet, hardworking, and according to Father Michael himself, a true blessing. He had boasted about paying her a generous wage, a testament to his Christian charity. I wondered now if that too was a lie. I decided it was time to pay Maria a visit. I needed to see what the church mice knew. I had a feeling they'd seen the wolf when he thought no one was watching. I found Maria's address through an old parish directory. She lived in a small, tidy apartment in a triple-decker in Dorchester, a neighborhood that felt a world away from the stately brownstones near St. Jude's. I stood on her doorstep for a full 5 minutes, my hand hovering over the doorbell, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. This was the first real step into the enemy's territory. This was no longer about numbers on a page. This was about people. When she opened the door, she looked startled to see me. Maria was a small woman with tired eyes and work-roughened hands. She was holding a toddler on her hip, and a cartoon was blaring in Spanish from a television in the living room. "Mrs. Vance?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked terrified, glancing over my shoulder as if she expected Father Michael himself to be standing on the pavement. "Hello, Maria. I'm so sorry to bother you at home," I said, keeping my voice soft and calm. "Could I possibly have a word with you?" It's very important. She hesitated, clutching her child a little tighter. I cannot. Father Michael, he said. She trailed off, her fear palpable. He said not to speak to me, I finished for her. I know, he told everyone that. Maria, he is lying about me. And I think he is lying to you too. I could see the conflict in her eyes. She was a devout woman, but she was also sharp. She had seen things. I pressed on gently. I know he pays you in cash every week. He told me it was because he wanted to help you, so you wouldn't have to worry about taxes or paperwork. He said it was a gift. Her expression shifted. A flicker of anger quickly suppressed. He says it is a blessing, she mumbled. It's not a blessing, Maria. It's a crime. It's called tax evasion. It means you have no record of employment, no social security being paid, no protection if you get hurt. He's not protecting you. He's using you. He's paying you less than minimum wage, isn't he? She looked down, her silence a confirmation. The story was always the same. He presented himself as the benevolent savior, but every act of his supposed charity was designed to benefit himself. He was keeping her off the books so there was no official record of her employment, no trail. He was keeping her poor and dependent. I am not here to cause you trouble, I said, my voice earnest. I am trying to find the truth. You clean his office. You take out his trash. You see the things that other people don't. I need to know what you've seen. She finally motioned for me to come inside, closing the door quickly behind me. The apartment was small but immaculate. She settled the child in front of the TV and turned to face me, wringing her hands. He is not a good man, she said, the words costing her a great deal. He drinks. Expensive wine. Many bottles. The boxes go to the recycling, but I see the receipts in his trash sometimes. From a store in the Back Bay. Very fancy. That was a start. Vanity. Greed. What else, Maria? He gets packages. From Delaware. Ecclesiastical Restorations. My blood turned to ice. You've seen that name? Yes, on the boxes. And on the bank papers he sometimes leaves on his desk. And he makes calls. To a man. He yells sometimes. About money, about being careful. He calls the man Lenny. Lenny. I had a name. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd had an hour ago. A man named Lenny, connected to the Delaware Shell Corporation. Maria, seeing the look on my face, continued, her voice gaining a bit of confidence. And the trips. He goes away. Once a month. He tells the parish he is on a spiritual retreat at a monastery in Spencer. But the clothes in his laundry bag when he returns, they are not from a monastery. They smell of cigar smoke and cheap perfume. She said the last words with a look of deep disdain. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Preaching poverty and piety from the pulpit on Sunday. Then living a secret life of luxury and vice funded by stolen donations. Maria went to a drawer and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a dry cleaning receipt she had found in the pocket of his suit jacket. It was from a shop in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Dated during the week he was supposedly in silent prayer with the Trappist monks. He thinks I cannot read English well, she said, a spark of defiance in her eyes. But I can. Maria, you are a very brave woman, I told her, my voice thick with emotion. I took out an envelope from my purse. It contained $500 in cash, a significant chunk of my dwindling savings. This is for you. For your trouble and for your courage. She pushed it back. No, I cannot. This is for God, to stop a bad man who wears the clothes of a good one. We argued for a moment, but I was insistent. Take it, I said. Use it for your child. Consider it a down payment on the wages he stole from you. When this is over, I will make sure you get every penny you are owed. She finally relented, tears welling in her eyes. I had an accomplice. Armed with this new information, I felt a surge of momentum. Lenny, Atlantic City. A fancy wine shop in the Back Bay. These were threads. I called my son David that night and told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment, then let out a low whistle. Mom, this is huge, he said. A name and a location. Lenny in Atlantic City. That's a classic mobster cliché, but sometimes clichés are true for a reason. He told me he had a friend, a private investigator in New York, who owed him a favor. He was a bit rough around the edges, but he was the best at digging up dirt on people who didn't want to be found. Let me make a call. This Lenny has to have a last name, and if he's connected to a Delaware corporation, he has a paper trail. We just need someone who knows how to read it. While David put his plan in motion, I focused on the wine. It felt like a small thing, but it was a tangible link to Michael's secret life. Maria had told me the name of the store. The Wine Press, a ridiculously expensive-looking place on Newberry Street. The next afternoon, I put on my best coat and my pearl earrings. the ones Frank had given me for our 25th anniversary, and took the tea downtown. I needed to look like I belonged there. Walking into the shop was like entering a different world. It was quiet and dimly lit, with floor-to-ceiling racks of wine bottles that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. A young man in a tailored suit and a condescending smile approached me. "May I help you, madam?" "Yes," I said, trying to project an air of casual wealth. "I'm looking for a gift from my priest for his anniversary. He has very particular tastes. He's a great admirer of French burgundies. I believe he shops here. Father Michael Donovan?" The young man's smile became a little more genuine. A big spending customer was a friend to all. "Ah, Father Mike, of course. One of our best clients. An impeccable palate. We just got in a case of the Romane Conti he adores. It's truly sublime." "That sounds lovely," I said, feigning interest. "He's so generous, always sharing his collection when he hosts fundraisers. I'm helping organize one now, and I wanted to get the details right. Do you happen to keep a record of his previous purchases? I'd hate to duplicate something he already has." The clerk hesitated. "Well, our client records are confidential." I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, letting it rest on the counter between us. "I would be so grateful for your discretion," I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially. "It's for a good cause, after all. The St. Francis Fund for the Homeless." I used the name of Frank's charity deliberately. The irony was so bitter it almost choked me. The clerk's eyes darted from the money to my face, and then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He disappeared into a back office. A few minutes later, he returned with a printout. "His full purchase history from the last 5 years," he said, sliding the papers across the counter and discreetly pocketing the bill. "Happy to help the needy." I thanked him and left the store, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the pages. I didn't look at them until I was safely back in my own kitchen. I smoothed the papers out on the table and began to read. It was a catalog of breathtaking indulgence, case after case of wine, with names I couldn't pronounce and prices that made me feel faint. Thousands of dollars a month, tens of thousands a year, more than my entire annual pension. And it was all delivered, not to the rectory at St. Jude's, but to a private climate-controlled storage unit in Somerville. The printout included the address. I had him. I had the proof of a lifestyle that was impossible on a priest's modest salary. I had the name of his accomplice. I had the location of his secret getaways. The threads were no longer separate. They were weaving themselves into a rope I would hand to him and let him do the rest. My son called late that night. His voice was electric. "Mom, I've got him." The PI is a magician. Our boy in Atlantic City has a name, Leonard Lenny Costello. He's a disbarred accountant from Philly. Did 5 years in state prison for fraud. He's small-time, a bottom feeder, but his specialty is setting up shell corporations and laundering money for, let's call them morally flexible clients. "And ecclesiastical restorations?" I asked, my pen hovering over my notepad. "Registered to a holding company, which is registered to another holding company. But at the very bottom of the Russian doll, the signatory is one Leonard Costello. And guess who one of his other major clients is? A casino promoter in Atlantic City, who has been flagged by the IRS for suspicious financial activity." It all clicked into place. The trips to Atlantic City weren't just for cheap perfume and cigars. Michael wasn't just a thief. He was a gambler. He was stealing money from the collection plate and Frank's charity to fund his addiction and his extravagant tastes, and using a disgraced accountant to wash it all clean through a fake church restoration company. "There's more," David said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. "Lenny Costello isn't just a paper pusher. He's also the sole director of a little organization called Catholic Charities Logistics." I closed my eyes. It was the fake charity he had used to drain my husband's fund. The circle was complete. The rage I felt was so clean and bright it felt like a beacon. The time for hiding in my attic was over. The time for defense was over. It was time to go on the attack. He thought I was a ghost. He was about to find out I was a hunter. My next move had to be precise. I had the what, the who, and the how. Now I needed irrefutable proof that would stand up to the church's army of lawyers and PR men. A private investigator's report and a wine store receipt weren't enough. They could be dismissed, spun as circumstantial. I needed something that tied Father Michael directly to Lenny Costello and the money. I needed something in his own voice. David and I devised a plan. It was devious, and it required a level of duplicity that made me uncomfortable, but I swallowed my reservations. Desperate times, as they say. The plan was this. I would use his own ego against him. I would arrange a meeting, just the two of us under the guise of seeking reconciliation. I would play the part of the broken, penitent old woman, confused and desperate for his forgiveness. I would make him believe he had utterly and completely won, and I would record every word. First, I needed a way to contact him. Calling the rectory was out. The new secretary would just turn me away, so I wrote him a letter. I used the delicate cream-colored stationery he had always complimented, and I wrote it by hand. I filled it with language he would understand, the language of faith, forgiveness, and sin. I wrote that the last few months had been a dark night of the soul for me, that I had prayed endlessly and had come to see the truth. I confessed that in my grief after Frank's death, my bookkeeping had become sloppy, that I had been confused. I didn't admit to stealing, but I admitted to a failure of diligence. I wrote that I understood why he had to do what he did, and that I held no bitterness. My only wish, I wrote, was to see him one last time, to ask for his priestly blessing in person, so that I could move on in peace. I ended the letter by saying I would be in the back pew after the 7 a.m. daily mass next Tuesday, in case he could find it in his heart to spare a moment for an old friend. I mailed the letter. And then I waited. It was the longest week of my life. I was gambling that his vanity, his deep-seated need to see himself as a magnanimous and forgiving figure, would be too powerful to resist. He would want to see me humbled. He would relish the opportunity to grant absolution to the woman he had destroyed. It was a sick, twisted thought, but I was certain I was right. On Tuesday morning, I woke before the sun. I dressed in a simple black dress, the same one I had worn to Frank's funeral. I needed to look the part. David had overnighted me a recording device. It was tiny, no bigger than a shirt button with a powerful microphone. I carefully secured it in the lining of my handbag, did a quick test to make sure it was working, and then drove to St. Jude's. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I pulled into the parking lot. I hadn't set foot on these grounds since the night I was thrown out. The church looked the same, its familiar stone steeple cutting into the pale morning sky, but it felt alien to me now. It was his house, not God's. I slipped into the back of the church just as Mass was beginning. There were only a dozen or so people there, the usual collection of devout seniors. I saw him on the altar, going through the sacred rituals, his voice smooth and resonant. He looked out at the small congregation, and for a fleeting second his eyes met mine. I saw a flicker of something, surprise, triumph, before his face settled back into its mask of pious serenity. He knew I was there. The bait had been taken. After the Mass ended and the other parishioners had shuffled out, I remained in the back pew, my head bowed as if in prayer, my heart thudding against my ribs. I heard his footsteps on the marble floor, slow and deliberate, echoing in the vast, empty church. He stopped at the end of my pew. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a soft balm of false sympathy. "I received your letter." It took a great deal of courage to write. I looked up at him. I let my eyes fill with tears, a performance I had rehearsed in front of my bathroom mirror. "Father Michael, thank you for seeing me. I just needed to tell you. I'm so sorry. For the trouble I've caused. For the mess." He slid into the pew beside me, leaving a respectable distance between us. The scent of his expensive cologne, a spicy, woody fragrance I now recognized as a sign of his hypocrisy, filled the air. "The Lord is a forgiving God, Eleanor, and I am merely his humble servant. There is nothing to forgive. But my reputation. The parish is healing," he said smoothly. "And your reputation is between you and God. Earthly matters are fleeting." He sounded like he was reading from a script. "I confess your letter brought me great peace. I have prayed for you every day, you know. It pained me deeply to see you fall into such confusion. This was it. I had to guide him down the path. The confusion, yes. After Frank passed, I wasn't myself. Things became so muddled. The accounts, all those new restoration projects you started. It was a lot to keep up with." I watched his face carefully. "Indeed," he said with a paternal sigh. "The work of the Lord is never-ending. The roof, the confessionals, the new organ fund. The expenses were significant, but thanks to the generosity of our donors we managed." "All those companies," I said, as if trying to recall a fuzzy detail. "Ecclesiastical restorations. They did so much of the work." A flicker of caution in his eyes, so fast I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking for it. "A very fine, reputable company. Recommended by the archdiocese itself. A bald-faced lie. It's a relief that the finances are in better hands now," I said, lowering my head again. "A professional from the diocese. It's for the best. I'm an old woman. I'm sure I made so many mistakes. That duplicate payment I read about in the auditor's preliminary report. The one to the restoration company? It must have been my error. He took the bait. He couldn't resist the urge to confirm his own brilliance and my incompetence. It was an unfortunate error, yes, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, but easily rectified. My friend at the company, Lenny, he was very understanding. He returned the funds immediately. My heart leaped. He had said the name, Lenny. He had connected himself to the company and the man. "You are a good man, Father," I whispered, "to have such friends, to manage it all. The parish, the special funds, everything. It is a heavy burden," he said, puffing up with pride, "but we all have our crosses to bear. The St. Francis Fund, for instance. It required a great deal of creative logistical management to get aid to the needy, far more complex than your dear Frank could have ever imagined." He was boasting now. He was so sure of his audience, a broken old woman who adored him, that his guard was completely down. He was confessing to me, cloaking his crimes in the language of competence and holy work. He was essentially admitting to draining Frank's fund, but reframing it as a necessary complex act of charity that was beyond my simple understanding. "I'm sure it was," I said. "You're a wonderful steward for the parish, Michael. Everyone says so. I do what I can," he said, the false modesty making my skin crawl. He then placed a hand on my head, the gesture of a priest bestowing a blessing. The touch felt like a burning coal. "Go in peace, Eleanor. Release your guilt. The matter is closed." "Thank you, Father," I said, my voice trembling, though this time it was not from fear but from the sheer, thrilling victory of the moment. I walked out of that church and into the bright morning sun, my handbag clutched to my chest like a holy relic. I didn't let myself breathe until I was back in my car, the doors locked. I reached into the bag and my fingers found the tiny device. It was still on. I had him. I had his vanity, his condescension, his confession. I had his voice. I had the whole, sordid, self-satisfied story, straight from the wolf's mouth. The next 48 hours were a flurry of activity. I overnighted the digital recorder to David, who had the audio professionally cleaned and transcribed. The final product was damning. Michael's voice, smooth and confident, admitting his connection to Lenny, boasting about his creative management of Frank's charity fund, and confirming his direct involvement in the very financial transactions he'd framed me for. It was all there. While David prepped the audio file, I moved on to the next phase of the plan. I couldn't just dump this information on the police or the archdiocese. That would lead to a quiet, internal investigation, lawyers, settlements, and a carefully worded press release about Father Michael retiring for health reasons. I had seen it happen a dozen times before. The institution would protect its own, and the truth would be suffocated in a pillow of bureaucracy. No, he had humiliated me publicly. I was going to return the favor. His punishment had to be as public as his sin. I did some research and found exactly who I was looking for. Melissa O'Connell, an investigative reporter for the Boston Globe. Her name was attached to a series of hard-hitting articles that had exposed a city council corruption scandal the year before. She was tenacious, well-respected, and had a reputation for protecting her sources. She was, in short, a bulldog. I sent her an anonymous email from a new, untraceable account I created at the public library. The subject line was, "The Sins of St. Jude's." In the body of the email, I gave her just enough to bait the hook. I wrote about a beloved Boston priest, a pattern of embezzlement from charitable funds, and a grieving widow who was framed to take the fall. I told her I had irrefutable proof, financial records, corporate documents, and a secret audio recording. I finished by saying that if she was interested in a story that would blow the lid off the Boston Archdiocese, she should be at a specific coffee shop in Jamaica Plain at 10 a.m. the next day, and to come alone. She was there. I recognized her from her picture in the paper. I watched her from across the street for 10 minutes, making sure she wasn't followed. I had a large manila envelope with me. Inside was a copy of everything. The wine store receipts, the information on Lenny Costello and the Shell corporations, the Atlantic City dry cleaning slip, and a transcript of the recording. I also included a USB drive containing the audio file itself. I had my son David call her phone at exactly 10:15. I watched as she answered. David, using a voice scrambler, simply said, "Check the trash receptacle by the bus stop across the street." Then he hung up. I had placed the envelope in the bin moments before, hidden under a newspaper. It felt cloak and dagger, like something out of a spy movie, but I couldn't risk being seen with her. She looked puzzled, then slowly crossed the street. I saw her reach into the bin and pull out the thick envelope. She looked around, her reporter's instincts on high alert. But I was just another old woman waiting for a bus. She opened the flap, glanced at the first page, and her eyes widened. She quickly tucked the package into her briefcase, hailed a cab, and was gone. The hook was set. Now I just had to wait for her to reel in the fish. The final piece of the plan was the most important. It was about timing. I knew the annual Bishop's Charity Gala was coming up in 3 weeks. It was the premier social event for the Boston Catholic community, a black tie affair held at the Fairmont Copley Plaza Hotel. It was a night of self-congratulation, where wealthy donors mingled with the church's top brass. And this year, the guest of honor, the recipient of the prestigious St. Thomas More Award for Community Service, was none other than Father Michael Donovan. It was his coronation, his ultimate victory lap, and it was going to be his execution. I sent one final anonymous email to Melissa O'Connell. It contained only 2 things: a digital copy of the invitation to the Bishop's Gala, and the line, "The curtain goes up in 3 weeks. Make sure you have a front row seat." The day of the gala, a strange calm settled over me. I had done everything I could. I had gathered the evidence, planted the seeds, and set the stage. The rest was out of my hands. I had put my faith not in God, but in the tenacity of a good reporter and the predictable arrogance of a guilty man. I didn't go to the gala, of course. My presence wasn't required. Instead, I spent the evening in my quiet living room. I made myself a cup of tea and turned on the local news just in case. Around 9 p.m., my phone rang. It was David. "Are you watching?" he asked, his voice crackling with excitement. "Watching what?" "Turn on the local news." "Channel 7, now." I fumbled for the remote. The channel was already on, showing a commercial. A moment later, it cut back to the studio. The anchor had a grave expression on her face. "We have breaking news tonight from the Fairmont Copley Plaza, where a major charity event for the Boston Archdiocese has been thrown into chaos." The screen switched to a live shot from outside the hotel. Flashing blue and red lights painted the historic facade. Reporters were clamoring against a police line. The camera zoomed in on the hotel entrance. And then I saw him, Father Michael. He was being led out in handcuffs. His face, usually so composed and serene, was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His perfectly tailored tuxedo was rumpled. One of Boston's finest was guiding him into the back of a police cruiser. The bishop himself was standing on the steps, his face pale, looking utterly bewildered as he was swarmed by reporters shouting questions. The anchor's voiceover explained what had happened. Just as Father Michael had taken the stage to accept his award, Melissa O'Connell's story had gone live on the Boston Globe's website. The headline was explosive: "Man of God, Master of Deceit St. Jude's priest accused of embezzlement, fraud, and framing a parishioner." Simultaneously, someone, David I later learned, had hired a tech-savvy college kid to do it, had hacked the audio-visual system in the ballroom. The giant screens on either side of the stage, which were supposed to be showing a hagiographic video tribute to Father Michael, suddenly lit up with scanned images of the wine receipts, the wire transfers to Lenny Costello's Shell Corporation, and the damning transcript of his confession to me. The audio from my recording began playing over the ballroom's sound system, his smug, condescending voice filling the stunned silence as he boasted about his crimes. It was a masterfully coordinated attack. He was exposed, judged, and condemned in front of the very people whose approval he craved most. His entire world, the bishop, the wealthy donors, the community leaders, saw him for what he was at the exact same moment. There was no room for spin, no chance for a quiet cover-up. The police, tipped off by O'Connell's editor just before the story broke, were waiting in the wings. They had walked into the ballroom mid-speech to arrest him. It was a public humiliation so total, so absolute, that it was almost biblical in its scope. He had built his kingdom on lies, and I had brought the walls crashing down around him in one spectacular, fiery collapse. I sat there on my sofa, watching the scene unfold on my television, and I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt a profound and quiet sense of order, of a balance being restored. A great and terrible wrong had been righted. The truth, Frank's truth with its sharp elbows, had finally made its way into the light. I had cleared my name, and I had defended his legacy. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The story was everywhere, not just in Boston but nationally. The Archdiocese, caught completely flat-footed, was forced into a series of humiliating public apologies. They immediately settled with me, returning every cent of the stolen money to the parish and to the St. Francis Fund, along with a sizable private settlement for the damages to my reputation. which I quietly donated in its entirety. They fired the slick auditor who had accused me and opened a full-scale internal investigation that would ripple through the diocese for years to come. Lenny Costello was arrested in Atlantic City a day later and, facing a mountain of evidence, quickly agreed to testify against Michael in exchange for a reduced sentence. The women from my rosary group called, weeping with apologies. Parishioners left baskets of flowers on my doorstep. Mr. Chen, the council president, came to my home in person to beg for my forgiveness. I was polite to them all, but something had irrevocably broken. The simple, trusting faith I once had in the people and the structures around me was gone, and I knew it would never return. Father Michael, stripped of his priesthood and universally reviled, pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. He was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in state prison. I never saw him again, and I never wanted to. A few months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I was volunteering at the soup kitchen that the newly solvent St. Francis Fund was now able to operate 5 days a week. It was bustling, full of people finding a moment of warmth and a hot meal. The new priest at St. Jude's, a young, earnest man with kind eyes, had asked me to come back to run the books again, but I had politely declined. My work for the church was done. As I ladled soup into a bowl for a man with a tired, weathered face, I glanced out the window. Across the street, the familiar stone steeple of St. Jude's stood against the blue sky, looking exactly as it always had. It was just a building of brick and mortar, I realized. The good and the evil, the faith and the betrayal, that all came from the people inside it. He always preached that God sees everything, and in the end, I simply decided to give him a better view. The end.